When Charles Darwin introduced his theory of evolution through natural selection in his book On the Origin of Species in 1859, he really set the stage for a better understanding of how things change through time. And since then, evolutionary biologists have come a long way in explaining the varied ways that organisms, whether they're plants or animals or humans, how all of these organisms do change over time and why they change over time. Now, Charles Darwin talked about natural selection, and this is a very important part of evolution. But it's not the only process that occurs within evolution. And so today, as anthropologists, and certainly if we were looking at it, from a very strictly biological standpoint, we would be talking about genetic evolution, and we can understand how gene frequencies change over time through a variety of processes. This video is going to cover the four major mechanisms of genetic evolution that we can see in animals today, and also use that to understand animals from the past. So these four mechanisms are natural selection, mutation, random genetic drift, and gene flow, and we'll go through these one by one. Now, starting out with natural selection, this is the one that we're probably the most familiar with. Charles Darwin talked about natural selection, and his theory of natural selection sometimes gets reduced down to this phrase, survival of the fittest. And that's perhaps not the best way to explain natural selection, because it doesn't quite get to the detail that we need in our particular definition. For us, though, we can say that in natural selection, the forms that are the most fit to survive and reproduce will do so more than others in the population. So when we're talking about fitness, forms or individuals or characteristics that are most fit, that doesn't necessarily mean the individuals who are the biggest or the individuals who are the strongest. It means those individuals who can survive best in their environment. They have some sort of physical characteristic that allows them to live in their environment very well. So we're talking about adaptive advantages. And there are lots of different ways that a creature can be adaptively fit to its environment. For some creatures, it might be being big. For some, it's being small. For some, it's being bright colored. For some, it's being camouflaged. Every different organism has its own way of being fit according to the environment that it lives in. So in natural selection, we want to see that those individuals who are the most fit end up surviving. They live more successfully than others in their group, and they also have more offspring. They pass on that fit characteristic more often than others in that same population. Now, there are a few conditions of natural selection, a few things that happen that we can say sort of encapsulate the scenarios of natural selection. So on this graph, we're going to be charting a number of individuals along this axis and time along this bottom axis. And let's talk about bunnies, because we know that bunnies like to reproduce. So let's imagine that we have a population of bunnies. The first condition of natural selection is that populations increase infinitely. That means that if we start out with 2 bunnies down here, within a pretty short period of time, we're going to have a whole lot of bunnies. You put them together and they will just keep reproducing and keep reproducing and keep reproducing. However, the second condition of natural selection is that resources are limited. When we talk about resources, we're often talking about food. Every living thing needs some sort of food source, and certainly bunnies are no exception. So let's say that these bunnies like to eat carrots. And in this hypothetical population, the bunnies will keep having babies. However, there are only enough carrots to feed 100 individuals in this population. So when there are 2 bunnies, that's fine. When there are 20 bunnies, that's fine. When there are 40 bunnies, that's fine. When there are 60 bunnies, that's fine. All the way up until 99 and 100 bunnies in this population, everything's going to be okay, because all of the bunnies can get enough carrots to survive. However, once we get to point 101, once we get that 101st bunny, we're going to have a problem, because suddenly there aren't enough resources for all of the individuals in the population. The third condition of natural selection is that variation exists. Variation always exists within a population. And this third condition of natural selection also tells us that some variants are more successful. So in this population of bunnies, the bunnies are going to be a little bit different. I mean, yeah, they might look really similar, and for the most part they act the same way, but there will be some natural variation within the group. For the purpose of our little simulation here, let's imagine that some of these bunnies, while they still love eating carrots, they also can eat meat, all right, or they're little bloodsuckers. So we've got these vampire bunnies. They'd prefer to eat carrots, but if it comes down to it, they can go ahead and eat meat if they want to. It should be pretty obvious that at the point where we get here at 101 bunnies, those bunnies that can only eat carrots are going to suffer because they can't get the resources that they need. But these little vampire bunnies, they're going to be more successful because their food supply hasn't run out yet. Their resources have not yet been limited. So in this particular scenario, it makes those individuals more successful in this population. The fourth condition of natural selection is that those variations, so in the case of our vampire bunnies, it should be, again, pretty obvious that we're going to pass on that vampire trait more often than the carrot-eating bunnies are going to pass on their purely carrot-eating trait. So in this example, and I know it's very far-fetched, but in this example we see how a variation within a population can be selected for when it provides an advantage that others in that same population don't have. So let's talk about a couple of the different types of natural selection, because particular diagram, this is showing us a normal distribution of characteristics. In a normal distribution, this just means that most individuals have a mid-range expression of a characteristic. So what we see here, charting the number of individuals on the y-axis, and then this range of a characteristic along the x-axis, what this is telling us is that at the extremes of this particular range, there are fewer individuals who have that characteristic, and most individuals fall within the middle of that particular characteristic. To put this in an example that is perhaps a little bit more clear to understand, let's look at height, human height. If we look at all the humans all around the world, we can see that yes, there are some humans who are very, very short, but there aren't very many of them. And there are some humans that are very, very tall, but there aren't very many of them. Most of us are in this sort of average middle height range. And this is just my own estimate, between about 5'2" and 6'2". Most humans on the planet are in this middle bracket, and that's a normal distribution. From here, we can look at how natural selection affects populations. There are three main types of natural selection. The first is directional selection. Under directional selection, one extreme of the variation of a characteristic is selected for at a preference to the others. So we can see that our normal distribution here actually shifts to one extreme of the spectrum. An example of this might be in zebras. Now we know that zebras have stripes. This is not an accident. Stripes provide zebras with a bit of camouflage when they're in large herds, because the stripes make it visually confusing for predators like lions to pick one out when they're in a big group. So over time, zebras that have had stripy coats have been selected for, and those genes have been propagated into subsequent generations, which means that zebras that are less stripy sort of get left out. They get selected against. And certainly we can imagine if there were an all-white zebra or a zebra that had polka dots, it would stand out compared to the rest of the zebras, and it would get picked off by a predator. And so those genes, those bad genes, don't get passed on to the next generation. And instead, those stripier zebras continue being selected for. Another variant of directional selection is sexual selection. And this is just directional selection that acts on only one sex in a species. So it acts on males or females, but not both. If we look, for example, at peacocks and peahens, we can see that they look very different. And that's because peacocks, the males, have been subjected to a very specific type of directional selection. Over time, those males with the bright colors and big long tail feathers, they've been selected for because these characteristics are signals to the female peahens saying, I have great genes, don't I look attractive? You want to have my babies. So this is a result of basically mate competition between males. And it explains why female peacocks, or peahens rather, are pretty drab looking. They're not very colorful. They're brown. They have short feathers. That's because females don't have to compete for access to mates. So sexual selection happens when there's competition between one sex for access to the other sex, and it results in what we call sexual dimorphism. Sexual dimorphism is just a big physical difference between males and females in a species. Animals that are sexually dimorphic would be things like lions. We know that male lions are bigger. They have those nice big full manes. Gorillas are sexually dimorphic. Male gorillas are about twice the size of female gorillas. So sexual dimorphism, we see a difference in either shape or size or some sort of coloring, but the two sexes of a species look very different. Now humans are slightly sexually dimorphic, but not very much. In the average population, females are approximately 88% the size of males. So we're a little bit shorter than men, but not a lot shorter. And certainly we have nowhere the degree of sexual dimorphism as something like gorillas. Human males are not twice the size of human females. So we're only a little sexually dimorphic. Our next type of natural selection is stabilizing selection. In stabilizing selection, the average characteristic or the medium characteristic is selected for, and so our range of variation here is constricted, the extremes are selected out, and instead everyone ends up being grouped very tightly around this median range. An example of stabilizing selection would be in neonate head size, the size of our babies' heads when they're born. All of our babies' heads, there's some variation there, but they're roughly the same size when they're born. And that's because having a brain that's very small and a skull that's very small is not advantageous for humans. We have big brains for a reason. They let us do a lot of complex things. We have, incredible thought processes. We have culture. We have language. We have symbolism. We need big brains to do that. So natural selection selects out those babies with very small brains, and those genes don't get passed on to the next generation. But we also don't want to have babies whose heads are too big, because that could impede childbirth. And certainly in the days before C-sections, a child whose head was too big to exit its mother's birth canal would not survive the childbirth process, and probably its mother would not survive either. So big brains are also selected out at the time of birth. And what we get instead is that all babies have roughly this, average middle-sized brain or skulls when they're born. Now, sort of the opposite of stabilizing selection is disruptive selection. And in disruptive selection, the extremes of a characteristic are selected for, while the median characteristic is selected against. So if this is our normal distribution here, being average is selected against, and instead these characteristics on either side of average are selected for. A good example of this we can see in orangutan males. Now these are both male orangutans, but you can see they look very different. Up here we have the alpha male. He's got really nice long hair. He's a big guy, several hundred pounds. He's got these big cheek flanges going on. This is a very typical, alpha male. He would be very good looking to the females around him. This male looks a lot more like a female. And that's because orangutans have evolved this particular strategy in which big alpha males are sort of the heads of these one male multi-female groups. And so a big alpha male like this will have exclusive sexual access to a group of females around him. That means that he's the only one that's allowed to reproduce with those females. If another male wants to come and take his place, they're going to have to fight him for it. And again, this is a big ape. So any challenger for that position of dominance is going to have to also be very big and strong. You're not going to want to head into a fight if you're kind of, an average sized orangutan. On the other hand, we've got small guys like this. They have a different strategy. They remain small, they remain young looking, they remain female looking because they're able to use this as a way to pass on their own genes, but without getting beat up by the big alpha. With these guys, they manage to use their sort of feminine looks to basically sneak into a group of females, avoiding the detection of the big alpha. And then when they get close enough to a female, they can quickly have sex, pass on their genes, and get out of the way before the big alpha figures out what's going on. So in this scenario, being either a big orangutan or a small orangutan, those are things that have advantages. But if you're sort of a mid-sized orangutan male, you're not going to be in a good position because you're going to tip off this big guy if you try to get close to any of the girls. So this is a fun example of disruptive selection. The second mechanism of genetic evolution is mutation. Mutations are random accidents in the copying of genetic material. So every time a being reproduces, a parent has an offspring, they pass on their DNA, they pass on their genes, and they pass on an exact copy of their own genes. However, sometimes mistakes are made in this copying process. So in the example we see here, we have a parent, and this is a part of the DNA string. DNA is composed of billions and billions of pairs of proteins, and so parents pass on an exact copy of those proteins to their offspring. But every once in a while, there's a mistake, and the wrong protein gets copied. Now, most of the time, these mutations have no physical effect. You wouldn't even know that they're there. But sometimes these mistakes, these mutations, produce physical variations. The physical variations produced by mutation are what natural selection can act upon. So for example, if this part of the genetic code in the parent is the gene for blue eyes, then maybe this tiny little change in the offspring turns those blue eyes into green eyes. And so then if there's some sort of adaptive benefit to green eyes in the environment where this individual is living, natural selection could select for that particular trait. So mutations occur all the time. And again, every physical variation is a result of mutation. If it weren't for mutation, none of us would be here. There would be no such thing as humans. There wouldn't be lizards. There wouldn't be fish. There wouldn't be zebras. We would all still just be little single-celled organisms floating in a pool of water. So all life is built on millions and millions and billions of mutations. And the differences that are produced by mutations can be very small from one generation to the next. But if you have a long span of time, those small little changes can result in really big differences. So mutations are absolutely essential to the diversity of life that we see on the planet today. The third mechanism of genetic evolution is random genetic drift. And this is when there are changes in the gene pool because of random events. So this is sort of the opposite of natural selection. Looking at this picture here, we can see we start out with 3 green bugs and 6 brown bugs. But if someone were to come along and just accidentally step on 2 of the green bugs, we can see that this is the population that's left over. And so these are the individuals who will be passing on their genes to the next generation. That means that there will be more brown individuals in the next generation than green. Not because there's an advantage to being brown, but simply because the gene frequency, the number of brown genes versus the number of green genes in the population has changed. So random genetic drift decreases variation within a group, and characteristics can become more common even if they are not advantageous. An example in humans, we can see the high rates of polydactyly in Amish populations. As you know, Amish populations don't tend to grow very much by adding new members from the outside. And so once a mutation arises, and in this case for polydactyly, or having more than 5 fingers on a hand, it's not an advantageous gene, But it's not necessarily disadvantageous either, but it becomes more common in the population just because the gene pool is really small. So sometimes these characteristics can become fixed because random genetic drift decreases the overall gene pool variation. Our final characteristic or mechanism of genetic evolution is gene flow, and this is simply the exchange of genetic material between populations. So this is similar to the example of the raccoons that we had at the beginning of the semester. If we have 1, 2, 3, 4 different breeding populations of raccoons, the individuals in group 1 are more likely to reproduce with other individuals in group 1 simply because they're closer. But we know that there's always going to be the mixing or the sharing of genes, reproduction across these boundaries. So individuals at the edges of group 1 are likely to reproduce with individuals at the edge of group 2, and individuals at the edge of group 2 over here will reproduce with individuals at the edge of group 3. This allows genes from group 1 to move into group 2, and then because group 2 breeds with group 3, those same genes move into group 3, and they move into group 4. So mutations or characteristics that arise in one group can spread in subsequent generations into populations that are much further away, simply because there's always going to be mixing of genes at the borders of these breeding populations. And sometimes we'll see a mutation arising here that is neither advantageous nor disadvantageous, but maybe in another population it provides a distinct advantage. And so we might see natural selection acting upon that mutation over here. Gene flow is also what keeps populations a single species. As long as there is gene flow between groups, then there's going to be enough genetic similarity that this can all still be considered one species. If we were to put some sort of divide in here, some sort of barrier, so there wasn't sufficient gene flow, then we would see a diversification of these groups, and each group would sort of go off on its own evolutionary trajectory. So those are our 4 mechanisms of genetic evolution: natural selection, mutation, random genetic drift, and gene flow. And all of these are important, and all of these have contributed to all of the life that we see on the planet Earth. And that includes us, it includes all the other animals and plants. Without these 4 mechanisms of genetic evolution, we could not explain the life that we see.